How's it going? So in this video, I wanted to make a very brief point. I'd have thought earlier that we could possibly equate um, false campaign promises to a kind of false advertising, where the candidate promises to render a specific electoral or political outcome in order to gain victory in the election, but ultimately upon taking office. So in that sense, electoral aspirations concede to in-office realities, and how what ultimately happens is candidates will make campaign promises on the trail, and the campaign aspirations have to concede eventually to in-office realities where, oh, we can't actually do what we promised because of X, Y, and Z. And but this is a kind of, these types of promises end up being a kind of illegal false advertising, right? Which is a codifiable legal wrong. So yeah, I promise to do this, but won't do it ultimately upon taking office, because I only wanted to gain an electoral victory, perhaps even knowing. So the question of whether it's actually wrong is whether it was the promise was no, yeah. Either way, if it's knowing or unknowing, a false campaign promise is a false campaign promise. It's a kind of false advertising, which is a codifiable legal wrong, at least in the realm of business, but that extends to any type of false advertising. Now, here's the problem with recognizing or with trying to assert that that a false campaign promise is an act of false advertising, is you can't hold a candidate, right, responsible for a false campaign promise in terms of it being false advertising. Because if you did that, you would ultimately find a candidate or a campaign guilty for illegitimate reasons, where there may be legitimate reasons that the promise could not be kept. And to hold them automatically responsible for a false campaign promise as an act of false advertising would potentially lead to situations where, so it would potentially lead to situations where the candidate genuinely could not keep the promise, right, due to other systemic and due to realities that were not anticipated on the campaign trail. A promise, a false campaign promise, or a promise not rendered in office, we can't simply hold the campaign responsible by calling it false advertising, because then we would hold them responsible for a false campaign promise that simply could not be kept for reasons the candidate could not anticipate. As campaign aspirations have to concede to in-office realities, and there may have been in-office realities the candidate could not anticipate. So you can't hold them responsible for false advertising as a false campaign promise, because they could legitimately, rather than illegitimately, have not been able to keep the promise due to in-office realities that were not anticipatable. So you can't hold them responsible for a false campaign promise as an act of false advertising, simply because the candidate cannot anticipate all of the in-office realities that could potentially prevent the keeping of the promise. There may be legitimate reasons the promise can't be kept, and because of that, it can't be cognized as an act of false advertising. because the candidate may have had the intention to follow through on the promise, but could not keep the promise because of in-office realities that one could not anticipate. In any case, a simple point, but wanted to make it. Thank you for watching.